Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. I'm really looking forward to today's Conversing conversation. We're recording it on Election Day, November 5th, 2024, in the United States of America, at a time of tremendous political and social tension. This election, as much as any memorable election of recent decades, is an election that feels particularly fraught, consequential, complicated. It's been divisive, it's been hostile, it's been angry, but it also is a critical moment in American life. And we think, especially as Christian people, that we take our citizenship seriously, not equivalent to our discipleship, but seriously because of our discipleship, that the God who made all things cares about all people, loves all people, seeks justice for all people. And in the United States, where we have a form of government that we call democracy, where we have a chance to express our own opinion, we want to take that act of voting and of citizenship with great seriousness. Today, we're having a conversation between two people and myself who I treasure as great friends. One is Pete Wehner, who is a New York Times columnist and a columnist as well for The Atlantic, and part of the critical leadership of the Trinity Forum. And also Dr. David Goatley, who is the president of Fuller Theological Seminary and a person who I've come to not only know, but deeply respect. I'm thankful that they're joining me today in this conversation on Election Day. We're not here as prognosticators. We're not here as people who are going to be forecasting any election outcomes. We're not here either to just say at the end of it all, oh, well, it'll all pass and all will be well. No, these are critical times and these are critical decisions. And the weight of our voting really does matter. And so we are having a conversation just to share with one another the things that we are seeing, thinking, feeling, observing around us, and that we want to call ourselves to and encourage you to consider as well. David and Pete, thanks so much for joining me on this important day of the 2024 presidential and national and regional elections. Welcome.
Thanks for having us, Mark. Good to be with you.
We all know that we are not representative of America. We are a select group of privileged people. We share a social conscience that comes from our own convictions personally and also out of our faith. We are people who are trying to lean into this day with great thoughtfulness and prayerfulness, with an awareness of just how complex and fraught our nation is right now. And we're not here really to prognosticate about the outcome of the election so much as we are just to pause as friends to think together about where we are. So let's just start because these words have been so prominent in our national conversation. There are just lots of feelings going on in our nation. And I just wonder if each of you could just give us a little bit of a window into what we're feeling on this day.
Well, I think that anxiety, this uncertainty about what will happen, I think that some of it is also, some of the anxiety is fueled by a number of the commentators in different areas who assert that this is the most important election of our lifetimes. Well, each election feels like it's the most important election of the lifetime. And we also live in a season and an era where people imagine the worst case scenario all of the time. We also live in an era where the media reports that we get often highlight the worst examples of who we are. So there may be a report of 10 people who have done horrible things, but you don't hear about the 10,000 people who are doing beautiful things and who are seeking to be faithful and just to be responsible citizens, for believers trying to be faithful in word and deed, for people who are not believers, just trying to be decent human beings. And so we have a tendency of focusing on the worst, of highlighting the worst and assuming that that is normative. And I think all of that contributes to the anxiety that people are feeling. My experience is that most people are living in relative close proximity to people who are just ordinary folks, just trying to go to work, trying to go to school, trying to be responsible family people, trying to make their contribution in whatever ways they understand it to be. So I think that there's a lot of external stirring of the anxiety and the uncertainty, while at the same time, we realize that this is, we're at a fork in the road of a certain kind of vision of who we ought to be and who we want to be. So I think that we're living in those kinds of crosswinds, and that's anxiety producing. One of the interesting things for me as an African American, however, is that many of us always live in the crosswinds. In a sense, it's good for more of our siblings in the country to be awakened to the significance of decisions and how our lives are affected. But that awakening also creates more distress and more churn. So some of us, some people, it's not just African American, there are women, for example, who know what it is to live with fragility. There are people who are impoverished. They don't know how they're going to make it from one week to the next, from 1 month to the next, or sometimes from one day to the next. So there are a number of people who know what it is to live with a lot of vulnerability and uncertainty. Right. And those of us who are believers have long known what it is to put our trust in something beyond the political structures, and that is on Christ. As old hymn says, the solid rock I stand.
Thanks, David. Pete?
Yeah, that's beautifully put, David. I'd echo that. I would say as a general matter that leading up to any election, there are feelings of anger and antipathy and fear. That's the nature of these things. People bring to elections very strong passions and beliefs, and the entire election system is set up to amplify those. So the question, I think, in some ways, is once you get through the election, whether things are dialed down or not. That tends to be the norm in American politics, but that's not been the case, I would say, as much recently. I'd also say, as somebody who's been involved in politics my entire life and aware that these emotions have always existed, they're more amplified, much more so, I would say, than in the past. To the point that I'm guessing, like both of you, I just know many stories of families dividing, friendships dividing over this particular moment and this particular era in politics. I have the sense that people feel like they share a continent but not a country to a degree that's, I'd say, unusual, at least in modern American history. And there's another phenomenon that's happening, which is discouraging, I'd say, particularly for those of us of the Christian faith, which social scientists refer to as affective polarization. Polarization is a sense of polarizing on one side and against the other. But affective polarization means that the feelings of negativity toward the other side are greater than your own feelings of affinity for your own side. So there's a sense of the other side being the enemy and being a threat. And the other thing that I'd say that marks probably this election more than most is catastrophizing, a real sense that if the election goes the wrong way, depending on where you stand for the election, that almost everything that people know and love will come crumbling down. I don't think that's the case in either outcome, but I think it feels that way to a lot of people. So I'd say the emotions are very much close to the surface. They're intense, and I think that they're driving us in ways that probably in our calmer moments, many people will look back and with regret and think that was not my best self, that was my worst self that came out. Having said that, this is an ongoing story. The capacity to recalibrate and to reset and to rethink is a human quality in America at its best. It's true of this country, and we have to hope that, in a sense, calmer heads prevail.
Thanks so much, Pete. I think for me, it's a moment of feeling some of the same things, of course. There's anxiety. There is, for me, grave concern for whatever the outcome, because there's so much about what lies on the other side of the outcome that itself carries a great deal of concern, regardless of how the outcome of the election turns. I'd also think that so much of what really will affect people's lives is going to be much more granular than the presidential election alone. Obviously, we have so many hundreds and hundreds of other offices and policies and other things that are on the election ballot. So I'm aware that there is a heaviness of in detail as well as in kind of the broad sweep of things, whether we're talking about, again, still at the national level, the balance of power in Congress, or whether we're talking about local politics and the particular school board people that might be elected, or the people that are in the city council, or whatever it might be. I think I also find myself really sobered by the moment, because it feels so impossible in this moment of entrenchedness. It feels impossible to understand what will bring about social union in a way that's not about, of course, uniformity or anything remotely like that, but somehow a sense of commonness that is as great or potentially even greater than the division, which obviously right now is the leading indicator of our social state. So the soberness, I think, for me is just being rather mystified. We've often in the past had a sense of singular leaders that can sometimes rise up and become that lightning rod that draws people together in a certain sort of way. It's hard to imagine that there is such a person in this era that could actually do that. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't such a person, but let's just say they're not in the headlines at the moment. So it feels like, is that really an imaginable thing? Is there a galvanizing force? I think the other part of it to me that has felt very, very heavy has been the splintering of the church and the alignment of the church with sectarian politics in a way that I'm sure has occurred throughout history in various ways. I know that that's been true, but this particular moment feels like it's the primary moment in at least my living memory of it being even close to being this divided, and the church itself having such contested visions of what, quote, a Christian way of seeing this moment really actually is. And there's so much division around that I think it also causes me some great sobriety when I think about being a Christian leader, being a pastor, having been a Christian just as an individual for decades, having been the leader of a theological institution. All of these things are things that give me an array of windows into what's going on, and most of them, for me at least, carry flashes, if not full-blown fires of concern. As David, you said beautifully, there is really also just an ordinariness of people carrying on with their lives, trying to make a reasonable decision in light of the pieces of information they think they've gathered and the convictions that they hold. But as we know, that also seems on display in a way that is very, very challenging and hard to get a hold of. I worshiped yesterday at one of my favorite churches in the Bay Area, Allen Temple Baptist Church, and Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Thompson preached on Romans 8:28, and her conviction was so powerfully proclaimed, which was just this deep sense that in the face of all that could press against the will of God and the purposes of God, that God is still God, and God will use all things. Not that God intends all things, but that God can use all things and will not let us go. And that hope, which she, as I said, proclaimed with power and beauty, was just a great word to me. And I think to many, many who were there that day. I'm sure that kind of word has gone out in many quadrants, and it was a very unifying word, and a word that felt like it was playing the long game rather than the short game of intense emotion and division. I'm curious, as we go on and think about this, we're sitting on this day without any sense of pontificating about what should and shouldn't be exactly. I think we're instead trying to just to bear witness to how we ourselves have been processing and living in this moment. And Pete, you've been obviously in a context where you've been able to give verbal expression in all of your articles to very strong convictions about what should be seen and understood about the moment that we're living in. And I guess I'm wondering if you step back from that for the moment and you begin to think about the long game, as I think Dr. Thompson yesterday was admonishing her congregation to do. What is the long game that you think of in light of the confusion and challenge of this period?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the long game is, I think, the way to think about it, because Christianity is about the long game. The entirety of Christian history has had ups and downs and twos and fros and moments of glory and moments of shame, which we need to name, we need to recognize, but we can't get stuck in the low moments without knowledge as followers of Jesus that there's an author and we're part of a story, and it's an unfolding story that ultimately has an ending of justice. So I think that's really, really important. I would say for me, for a lot of the people that I know, it's precisely setting the context, right? I mean, the balance wheel that's I think difficult for all of us, certainly difficult for me, is to both have, in a deep sense, this conviction that God does use all things. As you said, He doesn't intend all things, but He uses all things, and that ultimately all things are made new again. And that's very, very real. And on the other hand, to know really by the incarnational story, among other things, that God and Jesus care very much about the here and the now, mm-hmm. and in real time cares about human suffering and human injustice, and that moments, political moments, as well as other moments, bear on that question, and decisions that are made, leaders who take power, can advance human flourishing or can bring about human devastation, mm-hmm. and suffering. And so that's very real too. So that idea of being both in the present, but knowing that the present is in a larger arc. Yes. As I said, with a story, that's a challenge to keep. I think, at its best, the way that this works out is that it catalyzes people of conscience to be intensely involved in this moment, in the unfolding events of the world, but not to get captured by them, mm-hmm. and not to become hopeless within them, mm-hmm. or to feel like that this moment defines, mm-hmm. Everything. Because if you do, you can become a captive to fear. Right. And as you both know better than I, and have talked about this better than I, fear is not a Christian state of mind. It's, mm-hmm. I guess that in the Hebrew scriptures in the New Testament, be not afraid, or some version, be not afraid, is one of the most common injunctions that there is. So that idea of being involved, being active, but not being afraid, and being hopeful, because the hope is based on something real, is the right way to be. I struggle with it. I'm sure I've fallen on one side or another of those of that balance wheel from time to time. But I think my wiser self and my wiser friends are going to remind me of those two things.
It's very helpful. David?
I think the long game for believers is to hearken back to the early church and the affirmation that Jesus is Lord. And if Jesus is Lord, then that meant the emperor was not.
Yes.
That was a consequential confession. The stakes were high,
Right.
To say that the emperor is not Lord, and it could be a life and death decision. And I think that one of the challenges that we have today is that we've allowed so much of the society and its toxicity to infect the household of faith. And that it's difficult sometimes to see how some of our siblings, regardless of their partisan identity, how they are submitting themselves to the authority and to the lordship of Jesus, and not saying, this is what I want, and then using Jesus as a bumper sticker to say, and the scripture or Jesus or God wants this. And that's distressing, that's doing violence to the biblical text. I think that is a part of what our struggle is. I don't think it's a new struggle.
Right.
It has been present as long as people have been trying to be faithful. I think it is intensified now in part because it's so easy for people to get some kind of media platform, whether it's only their 10 friends or 1,000 people or 10,000 followers or more. And so both buffoonery is easy to broadcast, and things that are evil are easy to broadcast. And I think the long game for believers is how to align ourselves with Jesus, how to gather close to Jesus, close to the cross, and how to embody the commitment that we have to do all that we can to live at peace with one another.
Right.
And it does not appear often that some of our siblings are making very much effort at all to live peaceably with each other. This kind of vitriol and bravado and hubris that is celebrated in many parts of the world, that's not of God and that's not godly. And we need to be able to say that and encourage people to tone it down and back it up a bit so that we can listen to each other and learn from each other and treat each other with a kind of humility and gentleness that you do with your family. You don't rough up your family. So we do better with each other, we'll be able to be a better witness to the world. This kind of anger and volatility that's injurious to the Christian witness. If we're trying to be faithful, that is not what we want to happen.
Mark, if I could just very quickly add to what David said, and also a point that you had made, because I do think this is a painful moment for the Christian church in America. It's probably the most painful aspect, I would say, of this election season, the last few years for me, for reasons that you both dilated on. I would say that there's something useful in one respect, which is I think that this election in politics has served as a kind of CAT scan on the American church. What has happened didn't appear de novo. It isn't a recent moment. There was something that was happening within American Christianity that made it susceptible to this sort of toxicity and the partisanship. I'm not sure that we knew it, and I'm sure I didn't know it as well in the past as I do now. And we have a family therapist who uses the phrase that it's important to name things, name things within families, name things within relationships, name things with more broadly. Because if you don't name them, if you try and hide them, you really can't begin the process of recovery and healing. And I think something that has been revealed about American Christianity is that for a lot of people, and I think unwittingly so, their faith is subordinate or secondary to a lot of other factors that they really aren't very aware of. Sociology, family of origin, race, gender, country they live in, era they live in, communities that they're a part of, and that shapes sort of our thinking. And what we end up doing, and I struggle with this too, and I wonder, how am I doing it now? Which is, do I tack on Christianity? Do I tack on biblical verses to affirm what I already believe for entirely non-Christian reasons? And that, I think, is an important thing to both name and to consider and reflect on as we try and make our way out of this moment.
I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. You know, I think I'm not alone in thinking that perhaps this era could simply be called the era of fear. And one of the reasons why that is so prominent in American politics right now is the way that it exposes our desperation. And in our fear responses, the question is, what informs our fears? And then what do we think we have the capacity to do about what fears we have? And in this moment, just along the lines that you were just both indicating, there's a tremendous sense of preset that is about our social location, about real things that really are often very dangerous things and unjust things, and things that could really undo and have undone and are undoing many people's lives. So it's about real stuff. It's not about fantasy. The question is that can easily become encrusted with what I've come to think of as tyrannous fears, which are not really fears that are built on facts. They're built on simply social anxiety, by a culture of fear, by a desperation that, like fear is, can often cause either a fight or flight response. And if you're not going to flee, then fighting is the thing to do. And if fighting is the thing to do, then it naturally sort of self-justifies that you can and should use any means available in light of the depth of your fear. And that's what it feels like we are living through. And I think what the Christian faith allows us to find is a God who holds the whole ugly mess as well as its beauty and glory, and who does hold the long story, and who, despite all the things that to us feel like impending and immediate disaster, God sees that, and there are sometimes impending and immediate disasters. But even in the midst of the immediate disasters, God holds this longer story. Now, when I say those words, I'm always self-critical about that, because it can feel like what I'm suggesting is a kind of passivity that says, well, it'll all work out, and in an almost Quranic sense of just trusting that whatever happens is what God wills, which is just not how I understand reality or history. And therefore, I don't want to fall on that side of things that causes passivity. I think what I'm trying to feel for myself, and I hope will be part of the long game, is how the church reclaims the fear of the Lord, which is the grounding of all other fears, and the thing that can reorient us in a way that sets us free, rather than to be so bound in the kind of emotions and anxieties that we currently have.
Mark, what you just said speaks to something that I was thinking when, we talk about fight and flight
Yes.
as psychological responses to stress. But I think that there's one that, and I say yes, and there's also another option, and that is, if we think about these experiences as storms, is to learn how to stand
Yes.
firmly grounded in our
Yes.
faith,
Yes.
where we're not obligated to fight in ways that suggest that everything depends on us.
Right.
We're not having to run as though we have no agency,
Yes. Yes.
but that we're able to ground ourselves
Yes.
in our faith in God,
Yes.
and to continue to do what we can do to be faithful, to lean forward, but to stand firm, knowing that storms, there's an old spiritual song says, trouble don't last always. And that storms come and storms go. And sometimes you have to stand in the storm and weather the storm and lean forward so you don't get blown on your backside. And so I say yes, and
Right.
that for believers we do something else. And
Yes.
to wait on the Lord is not to sit passively by, as you
Right.
said.
Yeah.
But to wait on the Lord, it means to occupy yourself with what the Lord has called you to do until the change comes, so that you're working, you're doing what you can do. There's some who talk about when you're in a liminal space, you're not sure what's ahead, you can't go back. So what you do is you work on what you can work on. Work on yourself, work on your organization. You work on what you can work on until the Lord reveals the open door and what is next. And so I would say that for those of us who are believers, it's not that we can do nothing, regardless of where we are in politics. We can continue to work on being faithful witnesses in work and deed, and word and deed. We can work on listening better.
Yes.
We can work on crossing over those boundaries that we have chosen to live behind, that are often racial or ethnic, or often more times than we name, more around social economics.
Yes.
That we choose to live with a certain kind of homogeneity rather than exploring and learning from what we talk about. Now you've heard us talk about it fuller, about valuing the vibrant variety of God.
Right. Right.
And that means listening differently. It's learning. It means intentionally being in relationship with people who may not be in your normal orbit. If you just always take the same road to work and back, you're always going to see the same people.
Yes.
But to expand your reading,
Right.
Expand the ways that you engage.
Yes.
And so that is another piece that we can do to break out of this kind of conformity and this homogeneity, because when you assume that you're comfortable there, that circle's going to keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
Yes.
Because the game is always to find somebody else to exclude.
Yes.
It just seems like to me that those are some things that we can work on as believers.
Yeah.
So that we can be better together.
Yes.
And we can be better witnesses and better citizens.
Beautifully put. Thank you. Pete, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that all is exactly the right approach, the right tone to set, the right context. Again, I think we're all sort of struggling in our own ways with trying to be alert to the here and now, and yet to be faithful and not to be seized by by fear. And one thing I don't worry about with you, Mark, is passivity in terms of human life and being involved in people's lives. I think your ability to see it and to act within those sort of two sort of competing strains is a wonderful witness. I will say one thing which both have kind of alluded to in terms of this moment and how do we get out of it? Will a figure arise? There doesn't seem to be a person on the horizon that's going to be able to bring unity and comity to this country, and I don't see it right now either. The one thing that I do believe is that history and human life is both sort of human agency in a specific sense and moments as well, larger moments, inflection points. And often there are inflection points in a human life and in the life of a society that you just don't see. And it arises for factors that we're just not alert to. And when that moment arises, then that's a moment in which leaders can rise up and speak and shape.
Yes.
If the moment isn't there, I mean, you could take, I suppose, as an example, Winston Churchill, right? Churchill was the same person in the 30s as he was in the 40s. In the 30s, the constellation of events was such that he was a pariah, he was ignored, he was laughed at, and his warnings were unheeded. And then events changed, and all of a sudden, his message had resonance, and he stepped up. I think even in a narrower sense of somebody like Jonathan Haidt, a great social psychologist, who wrote a book called The Anxious Generation and has been pushing an agenda to make schools phone free. If John had made that argument 5, 6, 7 years ago, I don't think it would have gotten traction. But what's happened is that people, parents, teachers, even students have understood what's happening. And so John's argument and his book and his articulation of the issues met the moment.
Right.
And I do have a hope, maybe it's a wish, but I think it's grounded in something, which is that there's going to be an exhaustion that the public, by and large, is going to experience or is experiencing. They want this enmity to end. They don't feel good about the conflict, the hatred, the antipathy that we feel sort of at each other's throats. And the other thing is that it's just not the conditions for human flourishing. It just sort of pulls people down. And I think when we get to a moment in which that comes together, then that opens the way for figures and voices and movements to succeed in a way that maybe it hasn't succeeded as well. We got to be faithful. We may or may not be successful, but we got to be faithful and be ready and trust that those inflection points will come. And when they do, to take advantage of them.
Right. Amen.
Thank you, Pete, for naming that. And another way that I thought about while you were talking about, the phone-free, the idea of phone-free schools, and how now people can hear it in a way that they couldn't have heard it before. And I think that is, I appreciate you naming that, because there does need to be a context where there's a readiness for a better and a higher way. But sometimes there are these critical moments or crises moments where there is something that the context is about right, and then there's some critical event or experience. But then we also have to have this cultivated common value. And we have to keep on curating that and not let it be covered over by the layers of cynicism, the layers of, manipulative language that manipulate people's feelings and manipulate people's fears. That becomes a distraction to really what the real thing is. And so I think that kind of working on almost like a ignored garden, where you need to work on the soil and get the weeds out and and prepare the ground well for the kind of the common values that we have, and that, I don't think I'm foolishly optimistic. I think that there is this kind of common value that many, many, many people have, that we would do well to shine the light on the things, those deep core values that we share, of decency and respect, and fairness, those kinds of things, that we highlight those and help cultivate the ground so that when the moment is right, then it could take root.
Right. Yeah, that's beautifully put. There's a lovely line in the Prelude by Wordsworth: "What we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how." And I think about that, which is, if we embody those things, the things that we love, in a sense, can help other people love them as well. But of course, that requires those of us with people of faith to love the right things and to express it in a way that can be heard.
I had a phone call the other day with a friend who has been doing calling in some of the critical states of the election, and he's not there to really persuade people to take a certain position, but he asks about their position, and then he encourages them to vote, whatever their position is. And he said this experience, which he's been doing in elections since 2018, so he's now on his fourth election cycle of doing this kind of calling. And he said, it's really been such an important discipline for me, because I regularly, I do it frequently. So he said, I'm regularly exposed to people who just see the world in such a different way than I see the world. And I want to have them tell me as much as they want to tell me about why they hold the particular view they do. And he said, if it's not his view, he will say, those are not my views, but I am really grateful for the chance to understand and hear about your views. And there's something about the capacity to hold one another's difference respectfully, honorably, not argumentatively, not diminishingly, not punishingly, but just to hold it. And he's not a man without conviction. This is a person who has very strong convictions, but he's found this to be an amazingly important exercise. And I there's something about the way that he holds all those pieces together. The commonality, please vote, even if you're not voting in the way that I would wish you were voting. Nevertheless, I want you to vote. That's something we hold in common. And I now see the world more fully because of this conversation than I would otherwise. And it complicates my view of the world. And that's partly exactly what I want and need. I think that's to some degree an embodiment of some of the things we've just been talking about, this ability to hold a number of things, to stand into the storm, to not avoid it, to not want to talk to, quote, those people, but to actually hear, quote, those people and hold it in a different way than we might otherwise feel predisposed to doing.
Mark, you made reference to the worship experience I was at the Lake Avenue Church in Pasadena, and the Pastor Matthew John, I really appreciated a way he engaged talking about voting, and he encouraged people to pray before they vote, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And he encouraged people to pray, "Thy will be done in my family, thy will be done in my church, thy will be done in my community, thy will be done in my city, and thy will be done in my country." To pray that prayer and then vote. I thought that was a very helpful pastoral word.
Right.
A prayer to submit myself to the will of God.
Yes.
Now, how people play that out and what it does, I don't know. But I just think that I found that to be a very helpful pastoral word. To verbally submit yourself to the will of God in those repeated ways
Yes.
prior to casting a vote. And so it is helpful for pastors and for churches to encourage people to orient themselves to the Lord
Yes.
as they carry out their civic responsibilities.
And what makes that particularly poignant and interesting to me is that I know that congregation well enough to know that it's highly diverse politically. So it's not as though he has preset or the culture has preset what the implications of that will be in terms of how you pray and how you vote, but that wherever you are, let that be the hope that you have, that you're leaning toward and into what God intends.
What your friend reported, Mark, it's a great story. In my experience, it illustrates something that's almost a prerequisite for genuine conversation, meaningful conversation, which is a degree of trust that happens. In a way, I've come to see that one almost has to set aside the political and the contentious issues, or if they're there, as your friend was saying, which is, tell me how you came to believe what you believe. Tell me about your life journey. And over time, if it's authentic, it can create feelings of trust. And when those feelings of trust happen, then the guards go down, sort of the fists go down, and you have more authentic conversations, including people that may have doubts that they would never express to you if they felt like they were under assault, right? If I said, look, here are the 10 reasons you're wrong. I mean, the human instinct on something like that, particularly if it's at a core value or a core belief, is to fight back and to give no ground.
Yeah.
So part of it is just creating an environment of trust that you can have these kind of authentic conversations. And then, of course, it's the question, which is, what don't I see, right? It's very easy for me to observe what I consider to be blind spots of other people. But what about my own blind spots? Are by definition blind to me? And so then the question is, what is it? Through what mechanism, through what people, through what relationships can I have people in my life that help me to see things that right now I'm not seeing or seeing completely?
Right. I was struck a number of years ago, it was, I think in about 2018 or so, that Gary Haugen, the founder and CEO of International Justice Mission, spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast. And he spoke on a text in Galatians in which the core message is, God will not be mocked. And I was stunned really by the profundity of that affirmation, not least at that particular moment in political life following the 2016 election, all the division, the mockery of religion, the marketing of religion for the sake of political gain. And that can happen, across the political spectrum, obviously. And I just think one of the things that I find very hopeful, though it is a sobering word, is that we walk into today and its consequences with a confidence that ultimately God's self will not be mocked in this process. And that while God's people may sometimes even deserve being mocked, or at least can understandably be mocked, in God's self is not going to be mocked. And in that sense, God does have the final word, and it is that long word and that long hope, that long goodness and justice and love, which is God's being and God's relationship to humanity and God's relationship to people in all countries and contexts, including our own, and in all places of power and lack of power. God is the same and will not be mocked. And I think for me, that's a grounding verse in a certain way in affirming that there is something so much bigger and much more profound and eternal than simply the moment that we're in. And we believe that somehow this moment that we're in on this very day is a day where all of history turns. It would seem overblown, really, to put it in quite that way, even though it is consequential and it is really important. So as we finish, I want to say that, and also to join you both in saying, if you haven't voted, please vote today and express whatever conviction of faith and values you believe is the most important. And may God be with each of us who are here on this call, with any who might be listening, and to our nation in all of its diversity. Lord, we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you both so much for this conversation.
It's great being with both of you. Thanks for it, and thanks for your witnesses.
I joined in that Thanksgiving.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.